Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us on this super nice panel. We are really looking forward to it. And this is joint work with Pascal Siegers, who has another paper on this panel, and Johannes Breuer, both from the GESES Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Cologne. And we will talk about anti-media, party cues, and selective exposure to political information. So in recent years, we have seen a new type of political rhetoric, and that is very severe criticism of the media by political actors in democracies, in particular by right-wing populist actors like Donald Trump. In the UK, even criticism of the BBC by Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. And also, of course, very harsh new laws against the media, curbing media and press freedom in Eastern Europe. So with this project, we want to look at the individual level consequences of this, and we want to investigate how supporters of such actors, right-wing populist actors, react to such anti-media party cues. And one hypothesis that we have is that they might engage in selective exposure. That is, they will use the myriad potential that you now have in this high-choice news media environment to not select the media organizations and news domains that are criticized by their political actors, but rather go to alternative news sites, for instance, online, social media platforms, and so on. And this is, of course, taking place against the backdrop of a massive transformation of news media environments that has been described in communication science as fragmented audiences in an era of selective exposure, and high-choice news media environments. That would, to sum up, enable individuals to select these pieces of political information that conform very well with their predispositions. And of course, the potential consequences of this are fragmentation of public spheres, more polarization, less understanding of opposing political views. So again, our hypothesis is that these right-wing populist party supporters would behave differently when they are exposed to such anti-media party cues. And there's rich literature in political and communication science showing that indeed party supporters react to these cues in experimental studies. If they are facing such criticism, they will evaluate the media organization that is the target of that criticism less positively. We have also seen that in Germany, which is the case study we will look at here too, the supporters of the right-wing populist party AfD also have much lower levels of media trust than supporters of other parties. And we will revisit this in a second. On the other hand, so this was media distrust. On the other hand, there's also evidence that party identification indeed leads to selective exposure. There are well-known experimental studies from the US where you treat Republicans and Democrats with pieces of content from Fox News or MSNBC or the New York Times. And oftentimes the supporters of a given party will select the news media organization that is closer to their political views. Evidence from European countries is mixed. The media systems look much different than in the US. We have public broadcasters and so on. And therefore, it's intriguing to study these mechanisms outside of the US, which has a very bipolar political system. So we look at Germany, and in order to establish first whether there's indeed a signal, whether there are anti-media party cues by the supply side of political communication, political parties, we look at Twitter communication in the run-up of the German federal election in 2017. What we found is, we also use sentiment analysis, much more negative portrayal of the media and journalists by the AfD. If you are familiar with German, you will see some of the keywords at the top that are very typical for the AfD in tweets related to media or news. They talk about fake news, the old parties, the old media, the lying press, which is a famous notion by right-wing actors in Germany, whereas we find much more neutral keywords for the other political parties in Germany. We also hypothesize that these actors that treat their supporters of anti-media party cues would try to guide their supporters to other alternative sources of information especially hyperpartisan news sites. And we also find evidence for that. So we looked here at all of the URLs that were shared by politicians, and these were hundreds of candidates for these parties. And we see that the AfD is the only party with a noteworthy share of news URLs to hyperpartisan news sites. And indeed, even among AfD candidates, this is the most popular news type, so even more popular than articles shared by legacy press outlets. So taken together, we have this model that we also test with mediation models. So we hypothesize that these anti-media party queues will decrease trust in the media on behalf of the supporters of such parties, which will then in turn lead to selective exposure and certain tendencies that we will observe later in the empirical analysis. On the other hand, there's also direct path party identification. Identifying with such a party that is treating people with anti-media party queues should also have a direct effect on news selection, which means this could be something like a social identity theoretical path. So if you identify with such a party, a right-wing party, it's part of your identity to not go to public broadcasters. So we could also find evidence for that. So we kind of control for this indirect path via media distrust that is really important, as previous literature has shown. So we use or test this argument using two data sources. First one is a traditional election survey where we have self-reported media exposure measures. This is a well-established technique that has been validated in communication science. Yes, self-reports have issues, but at least this technique is the most precise self-report that we have on media exposure. We used the German longitudinal election study 2017, and we have this data for approximately 4,000 respondents. So the dependent variables where respondents were asked for a battery of news outlets, I think approximately 8, on how many days last week did you read political reports in the newspaper X, for instance, the Bild-Zeitung, or watch the television news on the Tagesschau or Heute Show and so on, and Heute Journal and so on. We have a host of independent variables, two, of course, party identification and media distrust, which was also asked in the survey. And we have several control variables that have been deemed important in previous work. We will jump right to the findings. So here we have very strong descriptive patterns. And that is really nice to see that if you just compare the two groups, AfD party identifiers versus identifier with another party, we see clear differences. So AfD supporters watch less of public broadcasting, they read less legacy press news outlets, and they have significantly lower levels of media trust than supporters of other parties. On the other hand, AfD supporters go significantly more to online news sites to get their news compared to legacy press and television news. And they also are more likely to be exposed to political news on social media compared to supporters of other parties. So this is already some descriptive evidence for the path that I was showing you before. Yes, and then we ran our mediation models, pretty complex models. I'm just going to plot you or show you the plots here of the main effects, which pretty much confirms the descriptive patterns we found before. So if we look here at the standardized effects, we see that being an AfD supporter has a significantly negative effect on being exposed or exposing yourself to public broadcasting news. There's also a very positive effect on online use and political social media use, which here, for instance, if you interpret these coefficients in substantive terms, AfD supporters would spend one more day per week reading online news than supporters of other parties, and approximately 1.5 days per week getting exposed to political news on social media. So there's evidence that these direct and indirect paths together at least add up to a picture that indicates that AfD supporters indeed have different news engagement patterns than supporters of other parties. And this was all based on survey self-reports. We all know that survey self-reports have limitations. They are not very accurate. Recall is, of course, an issue with such precise measurements of media exposure. And therefore, we verified the patterns using direct observations of people's online behavior. And for that, we got data from a commercial web tracking panel, so Respondi, and this panel tracks the browsing behavior of participants that have installed browser plugins. So of course they gave their informed consent, they get incentivized regularly, and they transfer this data to the market research company. So we have data for approximately 1 year, and this resulted in 55 million website visits by the approximately 1,200 people we study in this particular paper. And in order to make sense of all of these contents, we manually coded the top 5,000 visited domains by our panelists, whether they are news websites and whether they contain, or sorry, they belong to a similar category than the ones that were asked in the survey before. So legacy press, tabloid press, public broadcasters, and hyperpartisan news sites are the categories of interest, these categories for which we expect selective exposure by AFD supporters. Again, same plots as before. We first zoom into the descriptive findings, and these are again very strong and pretty clear. So again, in our panel, so the surveys were run by us, and we used similar survey items than before in the first study. We see that levels of media distrust are again higher for AFD supporters. We also see that they have higher shares of hyperpartisan news sites in their news diet, and they rely significantly less on public broadcasting news sites online. These are the multivariate results, including all control variables again. Same patterns as before, less public broadcasting exposure for these AFD supporters, more hyperpartisan news exposure, and this is a really interesting finding. So we find this only for this party. The other party supporters did not go to hyperpartisan news sites at all, but AFD supporters did. And with hyperpartisan news sites, we mean something like politically incorrect, Junge Freiheit, and Russia Today was also quoted as one, that have a very slanted perspective on political matters and especially on refugee policies that are, of course, important to AFD supporters. The effects for tabloid press outlets and legacy press outlets are insignificant, but of course, especially the legacy press outlet category contains heterogeneous outlets from the left to the right. So here, selective exposure tendencies should be less clear-cut. To sum up, supporters of the populist radical right party AFD expose themselves less to public broadcasters, and we find this in both studies. They go more to alternative sites or alternative sources of political information, which would be online news sites. They also get more political news on social network sites, at least based on self-reports, and they go more to hyperpartisan news sites. So unfortunately, with our data, we cannot see what is going on inside Facebook. Therefore, we cannot quantify to what extent what people see on Facebook is political. That would be super nice, of course, but the web tracking data does not allow for these inferences, so we can only make this inference here based on the self-reports from the survey. And the effects were not significant for these two categories, legacy press and tabloid press, but here the hypotheses were less clear-cut than for public broadcasters. Public broadcasters are regarded as part of the political establishment by AFD supporters. It's the same in the UK. So there's significant distrust of the BBC, and therefore supporters of right-wing parties should have a tendency to go less to these news sites. And that is indeed what we find in our study. We think that we innovate really with this paper significantly because we derive this evidence from survey self-reports, as well as digital trace data that was linked to the individual level. So we have a full special issue on that in Social Science Community Review, where different contributions demonstrate that linking digital trace data to individual level variables is a very useful strategy in the social sciences. We also find evidence for both paths, this indirect path mediated via media distrust, and also the direct path of party identification that leads to selective exposure. But here we get to the outlook, last slide. We need to investigate further to what extent these effects are really there at the individual level, and for that we are currently designing experiments, and it would be really nice to get your input on that. How can we really trace these effects of anti-media party cues? That is an important question for this project. And we could also move beyond this study by also looking at the content that was crawled. So which pieces of content were these people seeing and how does this relate to selective exposure? That's it for now. Thank you very much for your attention.